Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video, I'm wrapping up my coverage of Australian Survivor Blood versus Water by doing a player ranking for the season. Now I'll be running through all 24 players from this season, ranking them based on how I feel like they played on this season. And we got a lot to talk about, so let's just jump right into it with number 24. The worst player from Blood versus Water was one that I did debate over quite a bit between this person and the next person we'll be talking about. However, I feel like this person did more actively bad in the game, and because that I dropped them lower, and at 24 we do have Brianna. Now Brianna is someone that is a interesting case here of being someone that does outlast the next person we will be talking about, having at least survived a tribal council. And usually that is tough to do, to survive a tribal council and still be at the bottom of the player ranking. But to me, that just shows how actively bad I feel like Brianna played, because like even in that first round, the round that she survives, I feel like she probably plays it worse than the person that does actually end up going home, where she sets herself up for being the second boot. And while she does bond with Shay right away, when they find out about this idol that can only use that one tribal, the fact that they really go for it, when knowing that all the votes are already on Andy, when they see Chrissy going for it, when they already know all the votes are on Andy, it's just kind of dumb. Like, I don't get why they're going so hard for it, but also why Brianna in particular decides to go after Chrissy for her as the tribal, making it seem like, oh, she's trying to flush the idol, but again, it's an idol that's only good for one tribal. So again, all this like is really bad gameplay that really just causes Chrissy to want to target her moving forward, making her a really easy target for the very next round. But even in that second round, she does come off very schemy. She looks for the idol right in front of everybody, and is really just an easy consensus target at that point. And again, for me, Brianna plays so actively bad for me that despite her surviving a single tribal, certain other people didn't, I still have to land her here at number 24. Now number 23, the person that she outlasted, we do have Andy. And Andy, for me, again, like, I don't think Andy played well while he was there. I mean, obviously he's the first boot, but obviously there are other circumstances around that. Now, again, like, I don't think he did himself any favors by being domineering and being a bit too complacent with the Alex vote, but really, I feel like a lot of Andy's trajectory on this season was based around the target that was on his back coming into the season, with the fact that he was looked at as this very snaky player his first time around. And I think that really played a factor into why he was targeted so quickly on this season, where we hear both Mark and Nina talk about this as a reason to target him. And we even see Sam, after he is gone, talk about how Kate has a target on her back because of Andy's previous game. And again, I just feel like that was such a looming presence here that it's hard to really knock him too much for how he performed here, where I just feel like naturally he wasn't going to do well. Though I also feel like, again, he didn't do himself any favors. But to me, again, in comparison to Brianna, who just actively sabotages her game the entire time she's there, to me, Andy wasn't as bad. And because I have him here at number 23, number 22, the other person that never survived a single tribal, and that person is Kate. And Kate's a weird one here, where like Kate would have been at the bottom of the ranking had it not been for one pretty major fact, and the fact that she almost stayed. The fact that she didn't even get the majority of the votes on her. Now, coming into tribal, the plan was to vote for Kate anyway, until Juicy Dave blew up his game. But again, she does technically get idled out of the game, in a position where, again, she would have been safe had David not had an idol there. So again, that is like a pretty big pro for someone this low on the list to have. But also at the end of the day, it's like she didn't seem to have any super solid allies. She was the consensus target coming into tribal. And again, like, I do think the stigma of Andy played a little bit of a factor there, but still, I mean, like, I just feel like naturally, Kate isn't someone that is naturally going to do well in a game of Australian Survivor in particular. And again, like, she probably would have been on the bottom of the list had it not been for the fact that she was idled out, but because she's idled out, she technically didn't get the majority of the votes, which both Brianna and Andy did. So again, it's slightly better than that, but she's still here at number 22. Now, number 21, we're moving on to the person who should have been the fourth boot on this season, but did end up actually making it a bit longer, and that person is Sophie. Now, to me, Sophie has bigger highs than the last people we've talked about. I mean, she was someone that, at least at one point, was part of the majority alliance. I mean, at that first tribal, it did seem like the Sophie, Ben, Croc, Jordan contingent, plus the Sam and Jesse contingent were like the majority group early on, and it was Ben and Sophie that do stir the votes away from Sandra. So I do think Sophie had a level of leverage very early on in the game. The problem is that she obviously gets flipped on immediately afterwards, where Sandra and Amy work together to flip the votes onto Sophie and get Sam and Jesse on board. And I think it's a bigger indictment on Sophie here that Sam is willing to cut her at this point, considering Sam and Sophie seem to be pretty close while out there. Now she obviously gets voted out and comes back, and while she was pretty much dead to rights when she came back, I do feel like she also plays that part of the game pretty terribly as well, with her acting really emotionally, getting upset at her former allies for trying to disassociate with her and not really being able to hide her emotions much. Now, I will say that I will give her some credit strategically, in the sense that it did seem like she was willing to forgo that to try to create some sort of alliance with Sam, and she also tried to make an alliance with Khan. Again, I think those are some pretty optimal moves had she been able to execute them, but I mean, really, she was a goner at that point anyway, and really a lot of her game is mostly negatives, considering she was also booted twice, 4th boot of the season, and came off as an intimidating figure. But still, I think there is merit to her game, but she's still here at 21. Now, number 20, moving on to a guy that I know barely anything about, and that person is Jay. And again, we know very little about Jay. And for me, the big positive with Jay is that he did have a core alliance. He was close to Amy and David, and that 3 seemed to be working together, particularly in the Sophie vote, where they're pretty much the core that puts that vote together. I will say that, again, it's not great that Amy tries to keep her idol secret from Jay in the round that he eventually goes home. That's not great. Also, the fact that Jay is even targeted in that round, despite Amy having an idol, is also pretty bad. Where, again, for some reason, they split the votes with more votes on him than her, which makes no sense. And I believe I've heard that part of this was due to some sort of fight he had with Ben earlier, which is if that's the case, then obviously that's bad on him as well. But again, really, we know very little about Jay. We know nothing about Jay because he wasn't on the show. But based on his game position of having solid allies in Amy and David, and again, at least pulling off the Sophie blindside, it was enough to put him here. But again, there's really not much else to say about him. So he's here at number 20. Now, number 19, we're moving on to his loved one, I guess, and that is Alex. And Alex is a strange case here, obviously, because Alex quits the game. But I will say that I feel like Alex is a player that probably had some potential had he not had to quit the game. Now, realistically, I don't know how much of a killer instinct he really had, but people really liked him. His entire tribe seemed to really love him, to the point where, again, they didn't want to vote him out, despite having multiple opportunities to do so. In a position where, again, his back was so injured he could barely even compete in competitions, and also to the point where he had to quit to leave the game over actually being voted out. Now, part of that is because I do suspect that they were all in on trying to get Sophie out and flushing some idols, but still, it is humorous that they wouldn't agree to vote out Alex and had to force him to quit. But really, I mean, again, by looking at the footage, it seems like there is a natural likability to him, to where just everyone didn't want him to go. And the Andy vote could have been a very easy Alex vote, but they decided to flip the votes on Andy. And again, it's something that you can credit to Andy just being a bigger threat, but still, I mean, I feel like the fact that they don't take out a guy with an injured back in a game that is extremely physical, and they have another opportunity the very next round in the Brianna vote, and don't take the opportunity, I do think that is impressive in its own right. But I mean, again, at the end of the day, really can't put him too much higher here than number 19. Now, number 18, we're jumping forward quite a bit in terms of placements. Again, everyone we've talked about so far were within the first 7 boots of the game. Now we're jumping all the way to 12th place, and here we have Mel. And again, this is another situation where we just don't know much about Mel's game because it was on the show. But based on the footage that we've seen, it doesn't look that good. I mean, it looks pretty bad. Now, she's outside the true core majority on the original Water Tribe, but still votes correctly, and she does vote out Andy and Brianna. But again, when the core is really Mark and Josh and Chrissy and Nina and Jordy, it's Mel isn't in that group. But eventually, when the swap ends up occurring, she's seemingly on the bottom, despite being in a group with all of her former tribe mates. Again, she's still on a tribe with Mark and Josh and Jordy. Again, all these people that she was originally on the water tribe with, but they're thinking about voting out Mel over people like an Amy, who they have no connection to. And I feel like that's pretty indicative of Mel's game, to where she was that much a fodder, to where they would rather keep around someone they don't know than Mel. And while the votes eventually flip on Sandra and then eventually on Amy, because Amy actively plays that round pretty poorly, she does eventually get voted out right before the merge and has to win a challenge to come back. And then coming into the merge, she's on the bottom and gets voted out the second vote after the merge, where again, she could have easily flipped the game at the Con vote. I mean, had she had the wherewithal to tell Con to play his idol and organize the minority, they could have easily taken control of that round, but Mel just doesn't. And in the very next round, she's just dead to water because like there's no room to maneuver there. So again, like for me, it's like there's not much praise to give to Mel's game. I mean, she's really just on the bottom the entire way in places where she shouldn't be at the bottom, in places where she had time to build bonds with people on her original tribe, and that original tribe is still wanting to target her. So add in the fact that she was voted out twice and like again didn't really have much control throughout the game, I do have to leave her here at number 18. Now number 17, moving on to a person that did outlast Mel, but I feel like had more impressive elements of her game along the way, and that person is Amy. Now Amy played a very mixed game to me, where she has a couple really bad rounds. I mean, the round that she is forced to flush her idol and Jay goes home, that's pretty bad. She obviously loses her closest ally and loses her idol. But, I mean, also, it's like she found an idol. And really, she found two idols, actually, considering in the first round, she was one of the people that found the clue to the idol at Tribal that wasn't shown in the show. So, I mean, again, like, I think that shows some display of her being able to more consistently find idols. Then also, again, you have her boot round, where that seemed to be a position where she actively blew up her game, where it did seem like Mel was the initial target, but through her campaigning to go for Jordan, they decided to flip the votes on her. Again, pretty bad there, but I do think she does good work in the Sophie round, where again, the Sophie round is one that, while the edit gives more of the credit to Sandra and has Sandra telling Amy to flip the vote, it's like Amy does flip the vote. I mean, Amy is the one that actually organized the votes together and get the Sophie blindside off. She also seems to be part of the initial majority on Blood Tribe, where she does seem to be close early on to that Sophie Ben contingent and was included in their plan. So again, like, I mean, there is some merit to her game, but again, there are those massive holes that make it hard to put her too much higher. But again, for me, leave it here number 17. Now number 16, we're moving on to a player that to me didn't do as much actively bad as Amy, but I think you could debate the spot with Amy, considering this person was voted out twice and also was actually probably outside of the majority group for longer, and that person is Ben. Now Ben's an interesting one because like I think Ben like isn't the worst player in the grand scheme of things. I mean, I think he's someone that is always going to struggle with threat level, considering how big he is and how physical he is, but in terms of his overall game potential, he's not like terrible. He seems like a very sound player, but I do think this game plays out pretty terribly for him. While he does start off the game pretty strong, and he is part of that core alliance with Sophie, Croc, and Jordan, and seems to be the one running the tribe early on, where him and Sophie are the ones to stir the votes away from Sandra. The problem is that obviously he gets flipped on immediately afterwards, where he's flipped on the Sophie vote, put on the bottom at that point, though again, like he gets out his target in Jay the very next round. Again, supposedly he got in a fight with Jay. Again, we don't know much about it because who knows who Jay is, but if that is the case, I think that is a pro for Ben. But once we get to the swap, again, like he's just kind of on the bottom for the rest of it, despite again being on a tribe where his original blood members have the majority. They vote out Sophie, and at that point he's on the bottom, where he becomes this big target as someone that you need to get out before the merge, or they're going to win out and all this stuff, and gets blindsided there, then comes back to the game, is also targeted, and does make a move that is, again, very self-preservation based in the fact of throwing Croc under bus after Croc tries to save him, which, again, like I'm conflicted on the move as a whole. Like, I do think, considering the position he was in where, like, the Croc move to get rid of Jesse was never going to be effective, I think it is obviously the optimal move to save yourself over Croc. But at the same time, I do feel like there were definitely better outcomes for Ben coming out of that round. If he had been able to save Croc, especially because Croc had an idol, he could have gotten Croc to play the idol. But again, I get the trust was gone because of the previous round, all this stuff. I get it. But I still feel like he probably could have played that round better. And obviously he is just booted next, and then also loses fire making to go home in a round where like he should have known he was going home. where like he's trying to like flush Khan's idol, despite the fact that like Sam literally just made a deal with Khan for him to give up his immunity necklace. Like that would be a really bad look for Sam to then try to flush Khan's idol after taking his immunity necklace. Like, why would she do that? And again, with him having taken Croc out in the previous round, just like, again, he's an easy target at that point, especially right before the merge. Like, I think there are like fallacies in his game, particularly in the back 3 rounds where he's pretty much a goner through those 3 rounds. But I do think there are points where he did have control in the game, particularly very early on. And for me, that's like enough to land him here, number 16. Number 15, moving on to the person booted right before him, and also technically right after him. And that person is Croc. Now, Croc's an interesting case because like much of his game is very similar to Ben's. I mean, he is in the same alliance as Ben early on in the game. Now, I do think Croc did less active work than Ben early on, at least from what we're showing the show, where again, we do see Ben try to stir the votes away from Sandra. We don't really see Croc doing much early on. And he is equally blindsided at the Sophie vote. He does equally vote out Jay. But I think a difference here is that Croc is part of the majority alliance coming to the swap, where he does create this majority with Sam, Jesse, and Chrissy. The problem is that he blows that up. And really doesn't even get his way along the way where like, I mean, obviously the Ben vote, the initial one, he didn't want that to happen, but it ends up happening. He tries to flip the votes onto Jesse, but it doesn't end up being effective. So again, there's probably actually bigger knocks against Croc than there are for Ben for me. But I think there's a couple differences here. I mean, one, he outlasts Ben. So like that's one reason why he's higher. 2, he had an idol and had the ability to find an idol. So I mean, that's something. Also was able to put himself in the core majority group on that tribe initially, which Ben was not able to do. And I think on paper, the Jesse move is the correct move for Croc and really for most people involved. But I mean, along with that, obviously comes some massive negatives, and the fact that he was even able to convince his own loved one in Chrissy to go along with his plan. And he's not able to convince Ben, the person that he's trying to save with his plan, to go along with the plan. That's very bad. So again, it is a game of very mixed signals. Again, for me, Croc and Ben are very, very close. Where again, I think Ben had a much better like first few days and then also has like bigger holes in his game as a whole. But I think Croc is probably more consistent along the way, though also has like a massive downfall. So again, it's close to me, but I did have Croc above him here at number 15. Now, number 14, we have someone that is really this high, largely due to longevity at this point. Because like outside of that, again, we didn't see much of this person's game either. And that person is Michelle. And I mean, again, Michelle made it very deep into the game. And while she is technically 10th place, she is voted out when there are only 7 people left in the game. And obviously it's due to Purgatory that her placement moves down. But again, that's very deep to make it into the game for someone that we know very little about, and someone that like didn't really seem to have much agency throughout the game. I mean, early on, it seemed like she was aligned with Sandra and was moving alongside her, and like that's something you have to give her like a level of credit for. I mean, during the J boot, she does start to get some content where she does rat out Amy, and that leads to her flushing her idol, and again, that's something. But beyond that, I mean, there's not really much to say. I mean, Michelle is there when Sophie goes home. She's there during the initial Ben vote out, and she works alongside Ben to vote out Croc, and then is voting with him when Ben gets voted out again. And like, I mean, she spends a lot of this like post-swap section of the game kind of in and out of the majority lines, kind of just really on the outside, hoping to be looped in. Then we get to the merge where again, she's back with Mel, but they're both on the bottom. Again, like they could have made a move at the con vote. They don't. They're on the bottom when Mel eventually actually goes home. And after that, Michelle's just kind of there while like bigger threats are being taken out. People like a Jesse, people like a Shay, a Jordy. They even take out KJ over her. And then it's really at the point where there's literally no one else outside of people in the core alliance at that point that Michelle does get voted out. Though to be fair, I mean, technically Dave did seem to be the initial target there, but then the vote flips at the last second, probably due to the concept of these people from Purgatory returning to where you need stronger people to face off against them. But again, like Michelle really just, we don't know much of what she did in the game. But again, she makes it very far and somehow squeezes through vote after vote. So again, that's really enough for her to land here at number 14. Now, number 13, we're jumping forward quite a bit. We're going all the way to a finalist here. And at number 13, we do a Shay. And this was the weird thing for me with Shay, where obviously Shay is one of the runners-up of the season. However, I don't think Shay played well at all. Like, I can't think of a single round where Shay actively played well. I mean, we look early on in the game where, like Brianna, she's fighting for that idol in a position where she's not even going to be able to use it effectively. Really just putting this target on her back from her having potentially gotten an idol. And we follow that up with her losing one of her closer allies in Brianna the very next round. She ends up flushing her own idol along the way. And while she does vote alongside the future core majority group of like Mark and Josh and Jordy and voting out Sandra and Amy and eventually Mel, it's like she's also like in danger by the end of the pre-merge to where she wins immunity at that final trial before the merge in the position where she probably would have been voted out had that not happened. And we come into the merge where again, like it's her or Khan that are going to be booted, with Khan being perceived to be the bigger target, but Shay also probably goes home. Had this not been a blood versus water season, Sam wouldn't have any incentive to vote out Khan over Shay. And in that position, I feel like she probably would have been able to organize the votes against Shay, considering it probably would have been very easy to do had she not been latched on to Mark. Now, the very next round, she wins immunity in a position where she would have gone home. And after that, she becomes like the secondary target to Jordy and eventually becomes the first person voted out to exile. Skips, 3 rounds of the game to come back into a position that obviously benefits her due to KJ finding the advantage. Again, nothing that Shay actively did. Again, Josh flips to vote out Sam in a position where, again, Shay didn't do anything actively there. She is part of the group that organizes the votes against David, but is also probably the less integral person to that. And also that's the round where she goes back on her deal with the women to take them on the spa, and that's really bad. Very next round, she votes out Jordy, but again, Jordy was going home anyway. And at that point, she's on the bottom, where she needs to win out. She wins the final 2 immunities, gets to the end where she gets 0 votes. So, I mean, like, again, like I don't know what there is to really praise here. I mean, there's really not much that she actively does. Really squeaks her way through winning certain competitions at the right times, but also like does fail in the fact that she does get voted out and has to come back into the game, and also makes a lot of suboptimal moves along the way, like the move at the reward challenge, and also in her flushing her own idol, and even in the votes that she's a part of, she doesn't really do much within those. So again, like there's really not much to praise for me with Shay. She's here at number 13. Now, number 12, we're moving on to a very special case here. And really, both of the next 2 people we're going to be talking about, the last 2 pre-mergers, are both very special cases. But at number 12, we do have Sandra. Again, like, I mean, Sandra played as well as she could have on this season. I mean, she had a massive target on her back. There really wasn't much she could really do about that. I mean, it's a target that is going to help her early on in the game, and the fact that they want to keep her as a shield. But again, once they get to a swap or merge, again, no real incentive to keep her around. I was surprised the vote didn't fall back on her after David played the idols. I mean, that's something to praise her for. Again, she's a part of the plan to vote out Sophie and is given the credit for it on the show. So, I mean, that's something. I do actually give her credit for the J vote in how she manages her relationships with the guys that she just blindsided. I think that's actually impressive. She also gets Amy to flush her idol. That's pretty good. So again, like I feel like her gameplay is like as good as what it could have been. It's just that there really wasn't much room for her to maneuver here. I mean, once she gets to swap, especially on a tribe with Nina, it's like, what can she do? I mean, she's going to be the easy boot there. And like, well, I mean, yes, you could say that like technically there are things that you could do. I mean, there are people like Dan Giesling and Big Brother who have got themselves out of very, very sticky situations, but it would still take a very abnormal move for her to get out of it. And again, I'm not saying that like Sandra's obviously at the top of the list. Like she's at number 12 here, and I feel like that feels about right. Played as well as she could have, but still didn't make a deep run. And really was never that well integrated within the game, was never really part of any majority alliance. So because of that, again, Sandra's left here at number 12. And number 11, again, the last pre-merger on the list, obviously a very, very special case here, and we do have Nina. And again, Nina's a weird one here, where obviously she gets medevac from the game, and we'll never know what would have happened in this game had that not happened. However, looking at the people that did make it far into the game, I mean, she was aligned with a lot of those people, where she was aligned with Mark and Josh and Jordy and Shay. And again, it does make you question, like, would she have been able to make a deep run alongside them? Or would she have been targeted by them like a Shay as someone that is a target around time to merge? To be honest, I suspect that is probably more likely. where I do suspect that these pairs would have still grouped up after the merge and targeted the more threatening singles, and Nina is obviously one of those people. So I don't know how Nina would have done in the end game, but again, like we won't know. But in terms of the game that she played while she was there, again, it is a solid game. I mean, the first round, the edit gives her a lot of credit for taking out Andy. Again, I personally don't believe this is like fully on Nina. I think this was more of a consensus thing where the entire Majority Alliance was on board with taking out Andy. But again, the edit gives credit to her, and to be honest, in a way that's kind of ridiculous in the fact that even in the finale, when Mark mentions the move, they very clearly Frankenbite it to have him also mention Nina as part of the move, which is just ridiculous. Again, it makes me think even more that like this was not actually Nina's move. But still, again, part of the majority got what she wanted to happen. Taking out Brianna allows Shay to become closer to her, so that's good. She does have to vote out her mom, so that's something. But there's also a swing vote and the Amy vote, but this sticks true to Josh. But again, like the question is like where she go from that point forward. But again, I feel like up until that point, she was a pretty important number in 2 of the tribals that she went to, while the Brianna and Sandra votes also did probably better her positions in the game. So it's a pretty strong game from what we're shown, but I do feel like in a way it is probably glorified a bit from her being medevaced. And because of that unknown, there really isn't much potential to move her much higher on the list. But I don't feel like she has as many deep flaws in her game as many of the other people we've already talked about. So that's why she's here number 11. Now number 10, we're moving on to a player that I'm actually kind of surprised this person is this high considering how long they were targeted in the game for. But really, I think that's indicative of this cast. But at number 10, we do have Khan. And Khan played a fine game. I mean, again, he has a public idol from the very beginning. He does get targeted throughout the game because he has a public idol. He's the first target at the merge, gets voted out there. But there's a couple things to talk about along the way. First up, he is the one that is given most of the credit for the Brianna vote. Now again, how much do I really believe this? Not really that much. Again, I suspect that, again, Brianna was probably the consensus target. And really, they brought up the Khan part of the story because it was relevant in the next round where he has this meeting with David. And also it's easy to sell the story of like Khan making sure Brianna not getting the idol and giving it to Shay was a thing of like, oh, him leading the charge. But still, I'm like still part of the majority during those first few rounds. And again, becomes targeted beyond that just because he has a public idol. Mind you, he tells everyone he has a public idol, but I also feel like they would have suspected he would have had an idol anyway. But again, literally every tribal he goes to from that point forward involves a plan to flush his idol. I mean, at the Sophie vote, they try to flush his idol, but Sophie goes home. The first Ben vote, the same thing. I guess not really at the Croc vote, but again at the second Ben vote. And again, he holds on to his idol the entire time, and something that's kind of impressive about him is that he's actually in the know for all these votes, where he knows Sophie's going home. He knows Ben's going home both times. And does actually pretty good work in the second Ben vote where he wins immunity and gives it to Sam, which makes it so Sam's never going to vote him out. And in turn, essentially guarantee that his side of him and Chrissy and Jesse and Sam are going to work together for that round. Also, the Croc vote, while he doesn't vote in the majority, it's been claimed in the next interviews that he knew what was going on. And the reason he doesn't vote for Croc is because he didn't want to piss off Chrissy. So again, like despite him being this like person that's perceived to be on the outs, he is technically in the majority for a lot of that portion of the game. And really at the merge, I think the main thing that makes me want to put him higher is this aspect of I don't think he's the merge vote had this not been Blood versus Water. I didn't think the Blood versus Water theme really screwed him over here in the sense that he was really close to Sam and Jesse, and I do think they would have fought for him to stay had they not had their loved ones be so adamant in voting out Khan. Sam in particular has shown a lot of game ability throughout this season, and I think for sure would have been able to organize the votes to keep him around. And even then, it would have been the optimal move for some of these people in the minority to work with him to keep him around, but doesn't end up going through because of this Blood versus Water theme. Now, I will also say that I have to knock him for not recognizing that he was being the target at the merge here, in a position where the guys weren't even really hiding it that well, that they were targeting him. I mean, Sam and Mark are openly talking about him being the target as he's walking up to him, and that's not great. And also a bad sign that he wasn't able to get the minority to vote alongside him, in the sense that he didn't have a strong enough bond with the Mels and Michelles to even think of this as a possibility of working with him moving forward, where they actively wanted to target him, even though it not being in their best interest. So again, I think those are bad, but he was in the majority for a lot of the game, and I think he would have been safe had it not been Blood versus Water. So again, that's enough for me to land him here at number 10. Now number 9, moving on to a very mixed player, a player that played very terribly early on, but has a pretty big recovery by the end of it, and that person is Juicy Dave. Again, Dave plays terribly at the beginning. I mean, like, despite him being someone that they want to keep around for physical strength, he actively blows up his game at the first tribal he goes to, really makes an enemy out of Sam in a position where she's able to flip the votes onto him, but he ends up playing the idol to save himself. And also an idol that he didn't even find, he was just kind of gifted for going on the reward, a reward that he was chosen to go to because his loved one had been voted out already. So again, really nothing that he actively did. He's then the target for the very next round, and Sandra and Amy end up flipping the votes to save him. Again, I think you have to credit him for having the bond with Amy and Jay, that alliance to keep him around there. And despite him being the target again at the very next round, the votes end up stirring away from him and end up landing on Jay and Amy. But again, he's still on the outs for that round. So a pretty negative pre-swap game. Post-swap, he's able to get in line with the Mark and Josh and Jordy alliance and really just votes alongside them without having really much agency along the way, and like even getting rid of someone like an Amy who is perceived to be one of his closer allies. And really once he gets to the merge, again also just kind of falling in line, not really doing much there, being someone that was perceived to be alongside the other guys even though he wasn't really that well integrated within them. He ends up siding with Josh in the Josh versus Jordy war and sticks with that majority group until the end of Purgatory, where I do think him starting to target Mark and Sam is like good and bad, obviously. Like, it's good in the sense that he recognizes who the threats are and does try to take them out. It's just that I think his timing and his execution are all wrong, but ends up working out for him because Purgatory ends up happening and 3 people return to the game and they get the advantage that allows them to completely flip the game and vote out Jordan. And I do like a lot of the work he does during his last 2 rounds, actually, where he does a lot of good work in shifting the blame for the flip off of him and onto Sam, to where it does lead to Josh eventually voting off Sam. And in his actual boot round, he's this person that is able to flip someone like a KJ against Jordy and call out Jordy for what he did in tricking Shay into picking him for reward. And again, like, I think David, just in general, is a very intelligent person. I think that's the thing with David, is that he is a very smart person in real life. And because of that, picks up on things in Survivor, but not everything is there because he doesn't know the game. I think if he were a bigger fan, David could be a pretty good player, but because he's not a fan, he doesn't know what to do in these more unique scenarios that would only be applicable to Survivor, but is a very intelligent person in real life, to where he does pick up when other people are being duplicitous. Again, like, he's the first one to call out Sam for the game that she's playing, and he obviously calls out Jordy, and like, he knows how the game is being played, but isn't able to react accordingly. And I think that's the biggest issue with Dave. But again, it is a big bag of a game. Again, terrible first third, decently strong end of his game, but it's really that middle section that's like, it's just kind of nothing. And it really just leaves him as like a middling player to me. But the one thing that does put him as high as he is here is the fact that he probably wins the game if he gets the end against someone other than the big 3 in Mark, Josh, and Jordy, where he does seem like the most likely winner of non-big threats. And while the fact that he was targeted before those 3 is pretty indicative of his game, I still think overall his win equity at that point is still kind of impressive. So again, it's enough for him to land here at number 9. Now number 8, moving on to one of the last few people on the board here that were voted out twice. But with this person, I don't really discredit them that much for their first vote out, and that person is KJ. Now, KJ obviously played a weird game here in the sense that she's also rarely in power throughout the game, never is really able to gain much leverage within the game, but still has a lot of longevity and also does make strategic moves at points. I mean, like, early on in the game, she's just riding outside the core alliance where she's there voting out Andy and Brianna, but doesn't seem to be that integral to those votes. She does eventually vote out her own sister in Sophie, though at one point does organize a plan to split the votes onto Khan, and like, I don't know how effective that plan would have ever actually have been. But earlier she had like organized this plan to split the votes on Khan and pick out Khan of his idol. And like, I don't know how effective that plan actually would have been. But again, like, she does actively do work at that part of the game. She is part of the initial Ben blind side and eventually gets swapped over to the other tribe, to where they do vote out Mel over KJ, which is pretty indicative considering that group that voted out Mel had been with Mel for longer than KJ. But then at the merge, again, she's kind of on the bottom. She's one of these people that I do think should have organized to work with Khan to flip the game, but doesn't really end up doing so. And again, is on the bottom without much to do when Mel goes home. Sides with the Jordy side of things during the Josh and Jordy war where Jesse goes home. So ends up being on the bottom there. Also proceeds to be on the bottom as Shay and Jordy go home. But then again, she gets voted out immediately after Jordy, but again, in a weird circumstance where it's a vote immediately after the previous one with no immunity challenge. And I feel like overall this is just kind of a janky round. Like, well, to be honest, she probably would have been the boot anyway. I do think with like so little time to really work things out, I don't really fault her too much for being voted out there. And she comes back with Purgatory and eventually makes the move with the advantage that she's given to take out Jordan. And again, it's a good move. Now, again, I obviously have flaws with the fact that she was pretty much handed the advantage, but I do think she makes the best of it. I do think she makes a lot of correct decisions during that round, and that's something that does prop her up a bit. Now, immediately afterwards, again, Sam is blindsided. She's part of that group, but she doesn't really do much to actually stir things with that vote. But immediately afterwards, she flips on Jordy. And while she is ineffective in voting out Jordy, I do think her recognizing her current game position is something that I will give her credit for. And immediately after, she is successful in voting out Jordy. Though, I mean, at that point, again, like, Jordy was a pretty big consensus boot there. And then we get to her boot round, which is like, again, like, good and bad. I mean, I think it's good in the fact that she came pretty close to getting this all-girls group together to where had they been the final three, I mean, she probably would have had a decent chance at winning. But obviously, she ends up screwing up the plan, votes for Josh instead of Mark, which leads to her being voted on the revote. Again, that's pretty bad. Again, a pretty bad exit from the game, and really just overall kind of a middling game throughout. It's not an overly flashy game. It's not an overly like impressive game. It's really just like kind of a fine game with her being in and out of the majority at points, her being voted out and coming back to the game, but in a position where I don't really fault her too much. But then having like the big move of taking out Jordan, and then also I think you have to give her like a little bit of credit for getting in with the guys at points. But I mean, like, really at the end of the day, not a game that's overly impressive, but considering the longevity, she is here number 8. Now number 7, moving on to a player that kind of gets screwed over in a way, but doesn't really have that impressive a game as a whole, and that person is Jordan. Now, Jordan, again, is a weird one where back to the Ben and Crocs of the world, his game is very similar to them early on, where he is part of that initial majority group, then gets flipped on during the Sophie vote. He is part of the J vote, but then eventually gets swapped onto the same tribe as Josh and remains in the majority from that point forward and becomes the core of the majority group, working alongside Mark and Sam by the time they get to the merge. But again, he votes out Sandra. He is part of the Amy vote, though also gets targeted by Amy despite the fact that they were close, which is like not a great sign there. But again, once he gets to merge, I mean, he's part of the dominant alliance that before Purgatory were running the game all the way up until the final 6. I mean, he was in a dominant position, even though, again, like, he is probably the least important of those 4 that are in that position. Again, out of Mark, Sam, Josh, Jordan, Jordan is clearly the person that did the least amount of work out of that 4. Josh and Mark were people that were always going to beat Jordan. But again, I feel like he kind of gets screwed over, where in the tribe that he eventually goes home, again, he gets voted out because of this advantage that KJ was given at the auction, in a position where he would have been safe had that not happened. The plan was to vote for Jordy. They had the numbers to vote out Jordy, but because of this twist, he ends up getting voted out, and not even in a position where they directly actually wanted to target him, but more so that he was the safe vote, as they knew that Sam wouldn't play the idol on him. So again, like, it's kind of a crappy situation for that to be the way that he ends up going out here. Though realistically, I don't think he was winning the game anyway. I mean, even if this hadn't happened, I think he was always going to try to get to the end with Josh, to where Josh would have won. And even if like something like Purgatory never happened, then Mark and Sam had 2 idols at the final 6. So it's like, realistically, Jordan didn't really have that much of a chance and really doesn't do much actively well throughout the game. But I do think the fact that he was part of the dominant alliance after a merge and kind of gets screwed over in his actual boot round is enough for me to land him here at number 7. Now, number 6, we're jumping forward all the way to the other runner-up of the season that we haven't talked about, and that person is Chrissy. And Chrissy plays a strange game for me to assess here, because she's someone that, for a lot of the season, I was thinking of as this massive goat. This person who wasn't really even trying to play the game and was just letting Mark and Josh get to the end to where they were going to beat her. However, by the end of the season, my opinion of that kind of changed. I mean, she does start to play more so for herself. Now, again, like I think she is kind of like David, kind of misguided in the way that she's playing, where I think a lot of that is due to the fact that she doesn't have the game knowledge to recognize how she should play. But it does seem like she actively was trying to play to win the game and did have good social relationships with a lot of the cast. I mean, a lot of this cast really liked her and really wanted to keep her around. Mind you, I do think her being a perceived GOAT was also part of that. But again, like I still think she had good bonds with Mark and Josh and KJ and David and Sam. And it's like she had good relationships out there. And that is something to give her credit for. The problem is I don't think those relationships were ever translating to respect in terms of them voting for her at the end against a Mark or a Josh or a Jordy, all these people that she was in the end game with. To where, like, again, I don't think she could really win any scenario outside of getting to the end against Shay and KJ. And even then, it's not like a guarantee. I also feel like she doesn't really do much with her social ability. Her social game is using your social ability to maneuver through the game and optimizing your chances of winning the game. And I don't feel like Chrissy does that, where she's really just riding along with Mark and Josh throughout a lot of the game. And while she does try to differentiate herself at the very, very end, it's just way too late at that point. Again, I compared her move to try to vote out Mark at 5 to like Sarah voting out Ben in Winners at War. I compared her vote of voting out Josh at the Final Four to Ken voting out David at Final Four. And you know what the similarity between those things? Neither of those people won. And again, the comparison with Sarah is in this pretense of Chrissy wanting to go to the end with Josh. They still would have voted for Josh, even if she executed that move. It doesn't make any sense for her to do that. It doesn't really gain her any leverage from doing that, outside just sabotaging her relationship with Josh. And in the comparison to Ken, again, she's voting out her closest ally in Josh, but is doing it in a way that doesn't give her the credit for voting out Josh, where instead it gives Mark the credit for convincing Chrissy to vote out Josh, and instead makes Josh upset at her for voting him out. So I just feel like her final 2 rounds were very misguided in how she was approaching jury management. But again, like her game was dead by that point anyway. Unless she wanted to go to the end against KJ and Shay, which didn't seem to be what she wanted to do at first, at least. Again, she's part of the initial majority on water, but is also someone that is like looked at as a target for certain people, particularly Brianna. She does vote for Ben 3 times in a row. Successful in 2 of those attempts, but one of those is the Croc vote out, where through her not going along with Croc, she actively causes Croc to go home, which is obviously pretty bad there. And again, like she really just rides alongside this majority alliance without really contributing much to that alliance until the end game, where she's essentially the kingmaker at that point. So again, like it's tough to really give her too much credit, but in comparison to the rest of the cast, and considering her longevity in the game and also her remaining in the majority for most of the game, it's enough to land her here at number 6. Now, number 5, we're moving on to a player that I do debate over, is this too high for this person, considering he is the earliest boot left on the board, and he was booted very early on the merge, but I do feel like he did impressive work across the season and does get kind of screwed over by this blood versus water theme, and that person is Jesse. And again, Jesse was in a very strong position throughout the entire pre-merge, and him along with Sam ran all of their pre-merge tribes, where they were in a swing position early on in the game, being the ones that pulled the trigger on the Sophie move, were part of the split vote plan between Jay and Amy. At the swap, lead the charge against Sophie, and eventually Jesse gets sole credit on the edit for taking out Ben. And at the point where the game is about to flip on him, Croc is ineffective in trying to get the votes onto him, which causes Ben to go back to Jesse, and they flip the votes on Croc, which is a pretty impressive display of gameplay there. That, again, in that position, no one is wanting to vote out Jesse. Mind you, I think that's a situation where the blood versus water theme probably helped Jesse, and the fact that it did seem like part of the rationale from Chrissy was that she didn't want to piss off Jordy. Again, Jesse's back in the majority, voting out Ben, part of the initial core majority at the merge, and voting out Khan and Mel. So, I mean, that's, again, like over half the game where he is in a power position in the game. But then we get to his boot round. And again, like his boot round is a weird one where like he is taken out mainly because of Jordy. Because Jordy got a bit sloppy in him leaking information about Mark's idol, and through that causes Mark and Sam to flip over to the Josh side of things. And due to Sam obviously being married to Mark, that caused his closest ally and Sam have to vote him out there. Also, with the context of, like, he gets voted out here because Jordy wins immunity, where if Jordy did not win immunity, Jordy would have been the target first. And who knows if Jesse would have been able to reintegrate himself afterwards, as again, most of the issue there was Jordy, not with Jesse. So while obviously you gotta blame him for not being able to recognize that the votes were coming on him and flip the votes at that point, and you still feel like that round wasn't that poorly played from Jesse in terms of the vote. Obviously we gotta talk about the idol and giving it to Sam, which I will say, like, I don't fault him that much for. I mean, like, people talk about this as like, oh, an all-time dumb move of Jesse giving his idol to Sam. Like, to me, it's like that wouldn't even come across my mind that Sam would end up stealing the idol from me. But like, to me, this would be an insane move to make on something that isn't a blood versus water season. Because like, if Sam had been trying to play this game as an individual, I think her stealing Jesse's idol and taking out her own closest ally to get the idol is kind of an insane move. But because this is blood versus water, and again, Sam has Mark, and really, if either of them win, they win together, and her trying to propel Mark's game through getting this second idol, that's what makes this all a reality. But again, that's something that if I'm Jesse in the game, like, this wouldn't even be something that crosses my mind of a possibility. And also, I feel like just in general, the rules around this are just kind of wonky, where again, if this was US, this would not quantify as Sam's idol at this point. This would still be Jesse's idol. And once Jesse's voted out, the idol would be void. So again, like, it's also like, I do question how much they fully knew the rules of the idol, and how much Australian Survivor even cares enough to clarify the rules of the idol, because I do feel like that's also wonky in its own right. So again, like, I don't really fault Jesse too much for a lot of the events surrounding this, but considering he is a much earlier boot than everyone left on the board, it is tough to put him much higher. But again, I still think overall he played a pretty strong game in my eyes, and he's here at number 5. And at number 4, we're moving on to his loved one, a much later boot, but also a much more flawed game. We do have Jordy. And again, Jordy is a weird player here in the sense that, again, plays a pretty bad game for a lot of the post-merge. I mean, really from the point that Jesse goes home until his eventual boot, I think he plays pretty mediocrely, but he's still at the final 6 in a position where he probably wins the game if he gets to the end. I mean, the fact that the jury villa gave him like a standing ovation when he came in makes it very much seem like he was the clear front runner to win the game had he got there. But again, he has a pretty messy game all around. I mean, like, early on, I mean, he is part of the majority through the entire pre-merge section of the game. Again, he is in this core alliance with Josh and Mark. They vote out Andy. Again, part of the Andy vote, part of the Brianna vote. Gets the credit for the Sandra vote on the show, though again, I think that was a consensus vote. Part of the Amy vote, part of the Mel vote. In early merge, he's part of the Con and Mel votes. And then we get to the Jesse vote, where he is outplayed. He does get a bit sloppy again in the way that he tries to flip Josh against Mark by telling him about Mark's idol, only to then flip on Josh, which I also feel like is very questionable. And like, why'd he even bother to try to leak information about Mark's idol to begin with if he was going to side with Mark anyway? But at that point, I mean, he wins the next 2 immunities and gets voted out at the very next opportunity, going to purgatory, and then returning to the game in a position where KJ's advantage greatly benefits him, allows him to gain a level of control, but is still being targeted along the way. He's literally getting votes at every single tribal he attends. Where at the Sam vote, it was supposed to be a 4-4 tie. Josh flips at the last second. And like, while the show also like gives him a lot of credit for making this happen, I don't feel like he deserves that much credit for it. Where I do think one, David was probably more effective in doing this, and also I feel like Jordan from the jury also was effective in getting Josh to flip. Also, the next round where David is voted out, again, Jordy gets a lot of credit for his move at the reward, where he gets Shay to take him, but through that, he exposes that KJ's on the bottom, which causes KJ to turn on him. And eventually is the consensus boot at the very next round, where everyone turns on him, even KJ and Shay, the 2 people he was on purgatory with. So again, like, it's a pretty bad game. From the point Jesse leaves, the reason he's this high, though, is because, again, I feel like Jesse, before the Jesse boot, his game is really strong, but also he obviously has more longevity than Jesse, and also almost wins the game. Again, he is 3 rounds away from winning the game. That is something to give him some credit for. That, and also, like, again, like, I think strategically he is a decent player. I think he has a decent strategic mind for the game. His problem is execution, where, again, like, no one believes him when he tells people that Mark has 2 idols, which is, again, ridiculous that they don't believe him. He's ineffective in keeping people on his side, and like really just overall a mediocre game. But again, enough win equity at the end, enough longevity to leave him here at number 4. Now number 3, we're moving on to a player that to me was the one that was the most harmed by this being a Blood versus Water season, in the sense that I think if this person had been playing more self-interestedly, I think their win equity would have been much higher, but because they weren't even trying to win and more so trying to get someone else to win, they're left here at number 3, and that person is Sam. And again, Sam to me, again, like Jesse, had a very dominant pre-merge. Again, they worked together in dominating these tribes, really holding control for pretty much everything that happened in the pre-merge portion of the game, with Sam's relationships with other people being more highlighted along the way, where she does build a very strong bond with Khan, a very strong bond with Sophie initially until she has to backstab that. Even seem to have a strong bond with Sandra by the time she goes home. Like, Sam does do some pretty effective work in the pre-merge, but then the post-merge is where her game gets a bit rocky. And again, a lot of people criticize her in the post-merge for her just following Mark, which I just don't agree with that sentiment. I mean, yes, she is doing things that are more beneficial to Mark than for her game. But again, you have to realize that this is Blood versus Water, a game where she's not trying to win. She's trying to propel Mark to a win. And while I do think the Khan vote is one where obviously she didn't want that to happen, but even then I think it's a questionable move from Mark's end as an individual to get rid of Khan. Like, I think in terms of his alliance, I get the Khan boot. I do think for Mark as an individual, the Khan move was still like a bit questionable, especially over Shay. But despite that, like, Mark, Sam, Josh, and Jordan do become a core that are able to run the game pretty much until the Purgatory return. Or again, they take control of the game at the Jesse vote, where again, in that same round, she's able to steal Jesse's idol. Now, again, like, rules over the idols, very wonky. Also, the fact that she's getting rid of her closest ally outside of Mark is pretty bad. But again, this is a very beneficial move for Mark here, securing him a second idol to potentially use in the end game. And again, they really just hold the numbers moving forward. I mean, taking out Shay, Jordy, KJ, Michelle, and then they get kind of screwed over once the Purgatory return happens. So if that had not been the case, again, they would have already been at 6 with 2 idols, which would have been insane. But instead, they're at 9 now, in a position where KJ has his advantage. And even despite that, and Sam being one of the clear targets on the board, she's able to avoid being targeted there, mostly due to the threat of her having an idol. And to be honest, I think she kind of overplays her hand at that tribal, but it does end up working out for her. And then she's eventually booted the very next round. But again, in a position where she was okay with being booted, because at that point, that would mean Mark would have 2 idols at the time of the final 7, which is a very beneficial position to be in, more so than being 2 individual people with 1 idol at the 7. And also, I just think the entire situation around Sam being booted here, again, one is perpetuated by Purgatory, where Purgatory had not happened. Sam and Mark would have just outright been able to dominate the game at that point. But also, factoring in that Josh ends up flipping, with part of the reason being that Jordan was like signaling to him from the jury that Mark and Sam are lying to him, which is like, again, like something that's like kind of out of her control there, because like that's something that should technically not be allowed. So yeah, I mean, like overall, I feel like this is still a strong game. I mean, I think Sam completely ran her tribes in the pre-merge, and in the post-merge did everything she could to propel Mark to a win. But considering she was booted at 8 and also still wasn't playing as self-interestedly as the next 2, she is left here at number 3. Now number 2, and my top 2 were very close because I actually thought it was going to be switched until I watched the finale. Then after the finale, I did decide to go at number 2 here with Josh. And Josh, again, like for me, was number 1 coming into the finale. I did think he was going to be number 1, especially like considering I thought it was going to go to fire between him and Mark, and I thought he was going to lose in fire. That didn't end up happening, and he just ends up being a unanimous vote, which does put a bit of a knock against him in terms of his lack of threat management and also his lack of management of Chrissy in the end game. But again, like he plays a pretty dominant game from beginning to end. Now, he isn't a part of the Andy vote early on, but beyond that, he is voting with the majority the rest of the way and is portrayed as part of this core alliance with Mark and Jordy that by the time of the swap he seems to be the person that has the most relationships, where he is close to Nina and Shay as well, and also has this relationship with Chrissy, also builds a bond with David, has Jordan on his side at that point. So again, he's a very well integrated person in the game, and coming to the merge, he really just steamrolls from that point on alongside Mark and Sam, where Mark, Sam, Jordan, and Josh dominate the game, where they flip the game on Jesse and Jordy, voting out Jesse, really hold control until final 6, but then obviously Purgatory comes into play, and really at that point, despite him being screwed over by Purgatory, he still plays pretty well. Now, I do think, again, something that does annoy me about Josh's game is how much he tries to get his cake and eat it too, and the fact that he tries to pull off these big moves without wanting to get the blame for those big moves, and does it in a way that could just so easily backfire on him. Things like him flipping on Sam, I just think is a really dumb move, where, I mean, at the end of the day, it works out for him, but it really shouldn't have, considering in most situations, should have pissed off Mark to the point where he's not working for him, but also should have showed Jordy that he was willing to let Jordy go, considering he was telling Sam to play her idol. But again, the entire situation is perpetuated by Purgatory, and the people from Purgatory getting this advantage that takes out his loved one in Jordan, which I will say also, something I haven't even talked about in the video, I don't think, is this notion that Jordan could have given away immunity at that tribal when he gets exiled, which obviously he doesn't think of at the time. And to be honest, like, we don't know for sure if that would have been a thing that would have been allowed, but obviously if he could have, that's definitely a misstep there too. But again, not something I'm going to greatly fault him for. He then plays the final 7 pretty optimally and voting out David and keeping around the big targets in Jordy and Mark. But then I think his last 3 rounds, I think, are probably the most questionable part of his game, where at the final 6, he does vote out Jordy. And I think for Josh, it might have been worth risking keeping Jordy in the game. But again, I think Mark's idol definitely plays a factor into things, where you can't keep both Mark and Jordy. And realistically, voting out Mark, which I think in retrospect might have been a more optimal move, but it's like he couldn't, because like Mark was going to play his idol anyway. But if he had been able to get rid of Mark there, I think his game is in much better shape, where Mark is someone that is still willing to turn on Josh, as he eventually does at 4. Well, I don't think Jordy does. I think Jordy does stick true to Josh, because I think Jordy would think that he would beat Josh at the end in a situation where, like, I don't know if that's the case. I think it's going to come down to a pretty close vote between Josh and Jordy. But also his final 5 round, again, like him not being able to keep Chrissy in line, I think is pretty bad. And then for him to just completely lose Chrissy and Mark at 4 is pretty bad there as well. But again, like, it's still a dominant performance for a lot of the season, where really for me, like, his true flaws don't come out until the tail end of his game. In a game like Australian Survivor, a really, really long game, for you to not have any massive holes in your game until the last couple of rounds, that's still very impressive. So for me, Josh is here, number 2. Now number 1, and I mean, obviously, if you can't tell, I mean, it is the winner of the season. It is Mark. And Mark, to me, played a very impressive game on this season, but I will say that it definitely was benefited by this blood versus water theme. And I think it was also benefited from the fact that he actually took the time to study the game this time coming into it. Where I think his first time around in 2017, he just seemed to be playing more so on natural instinct. Where, like, I feel like now it is very clear that him and Sam did a lot of prep coming into the season. And I think Mark really expertly manages his threat level across the season in a way that he always has bigger threats around him, but is someone that is still perceived as a big threat, to where he would easily win if he gets to the end against anyone but those big threats, and would even still have a shot against those massive threats. I mean, right away, we see him being in a pretty dominant position on the original tribe, creating bonds with most of the tribe and being part of the core majority alliance, and seems to be the one that led the Andy vote. Now, again, this is kind of a weird thing, because again, the edit in the episode shows Nina being the leader of that vote, but then like Mark takes sole credit for it in Final Tribal, only for them to frankenbite a line in there of him saying "and Nina." But again, like, I do feel like it was probably Mark that did lead this charge. Now, I will say that I do think this is kind of a questionable move. I mean, the edit really props this up in Final Tribal of like, oh, this was a good move, and like, well, obviously it works out for him. I do think Andy could have been a very good shield for him moving forward. He doesn't technically vote out Brianna, but again, it's a split vote plan. It's fine. Remains in the majority, votes out Sandra, votes out Amy, finds an idol, and despite having a public idol in a position where both Shay and Khan become massive targets due to a public idol, he still is not targeted at the Mel vote. Coming to the merge, again, like, he forces the con vote, and I do think this is kind of a question mark. Now, again, like I've said this before, I think the con vote was this thing that the majority group had already agreed on, and Mark was just relaying this to Sam. And I do think Mark obviously agreed with this, but like, I don't know if this was the correct move. Again, it works out for him, but I do think personally I would have probably voted out Shay in this position, especially considering Mark and Con had a strong relationship, and so did Sam and Con. And also, like, with him, like, not even telling Sam about his idol at this point, that's kind of ridiculous too, so that's something. But either way, moving forward, again, part of the majority alongside Josh, Sam, and Jordan until the end of Purgatory, and along the way, Sam is able to steal the idol from Jesse and hands it to Mark, gets screwed over by Purgatory to where that causes him to lose Jordan and Sam, two of the people in his core alliance, leading to him having to use his idol at 7. But even in that position, it did seem like Juicy Dave was the actual real target, and they were only putting the votes on Mark to flush his idol, which again was a public idol. So it's not something I really like fault him too much for, especially because like that entire situation is one perpetrated by the people coming back from Purgatory to begin with, where if it had not been for that, he would have been at the final 6 with 2 idols in the position where he could have used both of them to just straight up get to Final 4 anyway, where he wouldn't have to care about these next few rounds. So again, like overall, like I don't really put much fault into him needing to play his idol at 7, and him wasting his idol at 6 is kind of questionable. I mean, like again, like personally, I would have done the same thing. I would have played the idols no matter what, but I do think he kind of makes himself look like kind of a doofus with the way that he's talking about how this is the ghost of Jesse and trying to prop this up as like this big move when in reality he didn't need it. But again, like I think he plays his final 2 rounds perfectly. I mean, like the way he's able to trick KJ into not voting for him and vote for Josh instead, that's pretty masterful. And then for him to have this very clear consensus target in Josh in that final round, where, I mean, to be honest, he would have gotten Josh out even without Chrissy's approval. Mind you, part of that was like kind of out of his hands, where like Josh voting for Chrissy was something that I think was more so on Josh, not really anything that Mark actively did. I think it was Josh recognizing that Chrissy wasn't on board and turned on Chrissy because of that. But still, again, just masterful management of his threat level in keeping around Josh to have as this easy target in a position where Mark probably would have been booted in most other scenarios. And for him to eventually get to the end here and win an unanimous vote, again, really a masterclass in threat management here. That while he did have some negativity along the way, had some pretty suboptimal moves, like playing his idol at 6 and certain treatment of jury members, I do still feel like he did play the best game of the season, and because of that, he is here at number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my ranking of every player from Australian Survivor Blood versus Water, wrapping up my coverage of the season. Now, obviously, whenever we get the next season of Australian Survivor, I'll be back doing similar sort of coverage for that. Also, along the way, I do want to do a merge boot ranking and a final juror ranking for Australian Survivor, so you can stay tuned to those at some point before the next season. And also, we got Survivor 42 and Baby Can 10 currently going on, so you can expect videos on those things as well. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.